will be no class. Next Thursday, of course, is Thanksgiving. And so I thought this would be a good time to do a recap essentially of the last three lessons. So here we go as we turn now to chapter 19 of First Samuel. Chapter 19 of First Samuel. And I'm not going to be reading every word of the text, but kind of bring us up to date as a summary. Like I said, the last two classes, and tonight we would end with the last part of chapter 19. But to get us all together, and before we get into the last part of chapter 19, you see at the beginning of chapter 19, of course, for Samuel, that Saul had urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. What is significant here is not just including his servants, he's including his own son Jonathan, the apparent heir to his throne. Now, on previous occasion, he had used some plots of people in the army and situations like those to try to kill David. But now, starting in chapter 19, he's turning to people closer to him, his servants, and servants, being a loose way of translating that is his workers, and as I said before, his very own son Jonathan. Now Jonathan and David were good friends, and he told Jonathan did, what his father was planning, and he warned him that he must find a hiding place out in the fields, and to avoid his father, to evade his father from killing him. Verse 3, I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you, and I'll tell you everything I can find out. Now, the next morning, Jonathan did speak to his father, saying many good things about him, and told his father, no, don't sin against David. He really hasn't done you any harm. In fact, he has supported you in so many ways. And he risked his life. Look at the time that he fought Goliath. Killed Goliath. He risked his life to save you and to give you a great victory. And the people of Israel, killing him, would not be a good thing. It would be a sin. Why kill an innocent man, a particular man like David, for no reason at all? Now, which is interesting, and you have to see how Paul was really suffering from depression, from fright, and how he seemed to be, I don't know, maybe bipolar or something like that. I'm just going by his behavior. Obviously we can't be certain of any of this, but at this point, he agreed. He listened to Jonathan, and he made a vow that he made a vow using the Lord's name. As surely as the Lord lives, David would not be killed. But as you will see later on, it was just a compulsive behavior with Saul. He just kept trying over and over to kill David. King Saul That is, of course, after he has said, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. So, you need to see how sometimes people may say one thing, but there are other things going on in their minds and their heart that makes them act differently, or soon afterwards forget about what they swore to do. So war broke out in verse number 8. You see that again with the Philistine. This was a terrible period of time. It went on for many years, of course. The fighting, sometimes skirmishes, but other times some serious encounters, and between the Philistines and the Israelites. Then verse 8, as I said, the war broke out, and David led troops against the Philistines. He attacked them with such fury that they ran away. But one day when Saul was sitting at home, verse 9, with a spear in his hand, and the tormenting spirit of the Lord suddenly came upon him as David played a harp. And Saul hurled a spear at David, but David dodged out the way, and the spear actually stuck in the wall. So David fled, escaping into the night. Now, this is not the first time, as you recall, that Saul attempted to kill David with a spear, with a javelin. Now, David ran, of course, didn't react, didn't try to, first of all, try to kill a king even in defense would have been a severe mistake. But anyhow, he respected Saul. He respected Saul, as you would see as we go on with the story. Now, Michal, the daughter of Saul, sent troops to watch David's house. They were told to kill David when he came out the next morning. No, I'm sorry. Saul sent troops to watch David's house. And his intention was to kill David the next morning. There was some kind of superstition about killing somebody at night in their own home and so forth and so on. But Michal, his wife, which was Saul's daughter, warned him, and so he escaped during the night. So by the time morning came, the next day came, when they tried to, the soldiers tried to kill David, she had put an idol in the bed covered with a blanket and a cushion of goat hair on his head, and that's the idol head. So when they came to arrest David, she told them he was sick and couldn't get out of bed. Now, when Saul heard this, when Saul heard this, he was completely enraged, and he said, "Bring him to me in his bed, as sick as he is, in his bed, that I can kill him." But when they went to get David out, they discovered, of course, that there was only an idol in the bed with a cushion, of goat's hair where his head would be. So that's what Michelle did, and we're going to see more as we go along how this all unfolded. So, of course, King Saul was mad, crazily mad with Michal, his daughter, and said, "Why have you allowed my enemy to escape?" This is very interesting because she's calling daughter's husband an enemy, but she was presented to marry David by Saul himself. So you see how confused Saul is, how mixed up he is, having this fear, this great fear of David that just drove him crazy. And as we have said before several times, not once up to this point, and you will see even later on, did he turn to God. We said this and we stressed this and asked God for guidance, and people have said this and put his concern to God and show faith. God, he was anointed, he was king. Show faith in God and what God had provided for him, and let God give him the answer as to why David seemed to be someone that God had chosen and seemingly to take over the throne. But he never went to David, to God. Saul never went to Saul, and that's why we say that his fear overcame his faith. And when we talk about fear, we want the opposite. We want our faith to overcome our fear, which is plain in the case of David, because so many attempts to kill him. Saul doesn't keep his word. David had to run and hide, and for a long time, as we get into the story, we'll see David was out there living as a hermit, and in a very poor situation of living, and and with all of that, and as we will see, had opportunity to retaliate against Saul, but did not. And so David had faith that God would work things out. God would take care of the situation with Saul. So David was doing the opposite all along. He was displaying faith in God. So here we go. In verse number 18, which would have been the last lesson that we shared. So David escaped and went to Ramah to see Samuel, and coming into tonight, of course, this is where we would be, and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then Samuel took David to live at Naioth. I'm sorry. When the report reached Saul that David was at Naioth in Ramah, he sent troops to capture him. But when they arrived, they saw Samuel leading a group of prophets who were prophesying. The Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also began to prophesy. They were caught up in the spirit of what was going on with Samuel and the other prophets. When Saul heard what had happened, he sent other troops, but they too prophesied. The same thing happened a third time. So God put this protection around us, spiritual protection around us when we're besieged and under stress and distress and everything else. And that's what happened. They came to capture David, came to kill David. He is with the spiritual, ecstatic presence of Samuel and the prophet, and the spirit would not allow anything bad to happen to him. In verse 22, we see finally Saul himself went to Ramah and arrived at the great well at Seku, where are Samuel and David? He demanded. You see how affected Saul was, how driven he was. 3 times he sent men over there, and they could not kill David. The spirit was too high. Then he himself went. Just like the time when the man didn't find, said that he was sick and he bring him to me, I'll kill him myself. What kind of rage was raising inside of, raging inside of Saul? Okay. Where are Samuel and David? He demanded in verse 22. They are at Naioth in Ramah, someone told him. But on the way to Naioth in Ramah, the Spirit of the Lord came even upon Saul, and he too began prophesying all the way to Naioth. He tore off his clothes and lay naked on the ground all day and night, prophesying in the presence of Samuel. The people who were watching exclaimed, "What is even Saul a prophet?" No, he was not. But God more than likely was speaking to him and giving him opportunity to change from this incessant um, uh, deliberate attempt to kill David. And as we will see later on, even though the Spirit of God came upon Saul, he still did not change and eventually went on to still try to kill Saul. David, I'm sorry. No, he was not a prophet. He was not really divinely touched in that sense. More than likely, Saul was being given a warning to leave David alone. And so as we conclude tonight, sometimes people may have spiritual experiences where God has given them messages, showing them things spiritually, showing them that He has the power even to paralyze them, so to speak, with a spiritual experience. But in all of that, sometimes people still rely more on their personal experiences, their personal biases, their obsession of not doing what is right, believing they're right. In the case of Saul, it was so obvious that he just was disconnected spiritually from God. Like I said, never returned to God for help, for guidance, for understanding, thinking that taking things into His hands, I don't know, God would defend him. If he killed David, God would forgive him. If he killed David, he would have an excuse to say, well, I'm the king and I had the power and God made me the king. So I use the power that I have as being a king to kill David because I considered him a threat and God uh, had anointed me. Well, it so happened that God also anointed David. It brings us to another realm of understanding. As we meet again after Thanksgiving, we will see that David's anointing was not simply to be a king, was not simply to be a great warrior and a leader of, of soldiers in battle. We see an indication right here that David's anointing was to protect him from Saul, among other things. David's anointing was to keep him being obedient to God. David anointed opposite to Saul, so Saul, as God explained, really did not relate to God in a spiritual way, did not appropriate, did not embrace the anointing of God to give him power and to do wonderful things in his life. And he lost that connection with his anointing because of the fear, the uncommon, remarkable, extraordinary fear that he had of David. And that's what fear can really do to people. It can take away their anointing benefits, so to speak. The very opposite, though, as we're talking about David, is that his faith in God allow his anointing to expand, to grow, to broaden his vision, as we will see later on, enhance his wisdom, and did other great things in his life, and gave him power to sustain and maintain and persevere uh, difficulties, all kind of difficulties that came up in his life. The anointing allowed him to overcome all sorts of things. And so it will do the same for us if we accept God touching our lives, anointing us and to spiritual heights and depths and width and breadth and everything else. It will keep us safe. It will give us strength. It will encourage us, and it will show us how we can overcome great fears that may come up in our lives. So we thank God that we're able to share all of this